Hi everyone, this is Nathan from Snap and welcome to another of our Snap XMP webinars. Today we're going to be looking at some of the important considerations when designing your questionnaires and forms and how they can impact on how accessible those forms are for your target audience. It should take about 30 minutes and as ever there's plenty of resources available on the support hub which I'll be pointing you to at the end. First of all, we'll explore what this ambiguous word looming over your head means. We're going to try and steer you away from thinking about the individual and start thinking about the everyone. We'll then take a look at what actual regulations it is that we're referring to and where you can find additional reading material. A heads up that you might want to find yourself a strong cup of coffee when you do embark on that journey. Throughout the session, I'll be covering things which Snap does, whether you like it or not, what Snap does for you as a default setting, and with that, things that you need to consider if you stray away from those defaults. And then we'll look at what you need to do should you decide to add certain content into your questionnaires and forms. In terms of benefits, well, the obvious one is that you're going to be compliant with the regulations. And with many of you working for or with government agencies, you would know that these are important regulations to uphold. But more than hitting regulations, you'll know that you have a questionnaire form that can be accessed and completed in full by anyone who seeks to complete it. And of course, with that comes more valuable data. So first off, what is accessibility? Well, let's straight away throw out the window the old adage of it's just for the blind. For many reasons, that's really not going to cut it. For a start, someone who is blind has different needs to someone who has low vision. Bring in tunnel vision and the needs evolve again. Whilst big spaced words might be good for one person, it might actually make things worse for another person. Word wrapping, for example, is very important for people who increase the screen size because having to scroll both vertically and horizontally is very awkward, particularly anyone that's got dexterity issues. And it's really important we think outside of the word that we've just thrown out the window. People who can't process text, so perhaps someone with a cognitive disability, may prefer a screen reader in order to hear something, allowing them to better understand rather than just reading something. And people who often use multiple assistive technologies or multiple adaptive strategies to get the information. Someone who is hard of hearing might still have the sound on, but they might want captions alongside to fill in the gaps. Other considerations include people using mobile phones, smartwatches, smart TVs and other devices with smaller screens and different input modes. It could be older people with changing abilities due to aging, a person typing with one hand, including temporary disabilities such as a broken arm. In fact, I remember attempting to press Control, Alt and Delete on my keyboard a few years back when I had a broken collarbone. It was quite painful to do and also no doubt quite funny to watch. I will say I did feel even more silly when it took my IT manager to point out that actually there's a second set of Control and Alt keys on the right hand side just below the Delete key, as well as the more commonly keys on the left. So it's amazing the sort of number of buttons and functions on a keyboard that we just never notice. Anyway, I guess my point here is that until you're sort of faced with a situation yourself, we ironically are sometimes blind to things. Talking situations, we also need to consider situational limitations, such as viewing something in bright sunlight, or perhaps using a slow internet connection, be that broadband or maybe a lack of 3, 4 or 5G. Video captions are a good example of not necessarily considering the full benefit. Here we're talking about loud environments where users cannot hear the audio. So for example, bars, maybe an airport or a concert. In quiet environments where users aren't able to turn the sound on. So they could be in a library, maybe on public transport, or perhaps someone else is sleeping. People who cannot understand the spoken language very well and perhaps understand the written language better. So for example, people whose native language is not the same language of the form. And people learning to read, which again includes, like I just mentioned, people learning a new language. And probably, if you were my two sons, then just because. In fact, there has been some research to say that 71% of students without hearing difficulties actually use captions, so primarily to help them focus and retain the information. So for some people, hearing audio and seeing text at the same time can help them. And really, it's as simple as that. Accessibility is about helping people. Many of these things are really quite obvious when you think about them, but often it's just something we just haven't considered. And that's why it's really important that we have these regulations to do the thinking for us. Okay, before we go any further, let's have a look at some of these names and acronyms and get those out of the way. Today, we're broadly talking about WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But this very much links in with US Section 508 for anyone that's listening in from across the pond, and also EN 301549 for those running projects in Europe. And I believe US Section 508 is similar to WCAG version 2, with EN 301549 being more aligned to WCAG 2.1. WCA2 2.2, this is the last one I promise, however, actually came out in October 2023, and so here we are today, looking at what we've got in store for you. So arguably some of the day might go beyond section 508 and EN 301, but no doubt those will be getting an update at some point over the coming months or years. So why not get ahead of the game, and more importantly, make your surveys and forms as user-friendly as possible when you have the opportunity. Now, some people, including myself, have questioned why we're doing a webinar in October 2024 when the new regulations were actually set in October 2023. Well, put simply, organisations were given a year to work their way through the regulations and make any adjustments needed. That includes any adjustments that we might have made to the software, but also applies to you to make sure that any existing surveys or forms are brought in line, and of course any newly created forms also take into account these new guidelines. Whether you've heard of WCAG or not before, it's very likely that you've heard of AA or AAA standard, or perhaps W3C, which is the Worldwide Web Consortium, which ultimately created the AA and AAA standard. And an interesting fact, in case anyone's off to do a quiz tonight, the W3C was founded by Tim Berners-Lee, who actually invented the web. So it's probably a good idea to start taking some notes of what's being said. Anyway, WCAG draws on the requirements of those A standards, but I just wanted to point out that the AA standard is the standard which the public sector organisations need to abide by. AAA is what we should be aiming for, but it is a bonus if we can get there. There will be things in there which are very much desirable, but equally things in there which might be unrealistic. Of course, the key to anything is just doing your best to make it as accessible as you can, and each project will have different needs based on the subject matter and who's going to be completing it and why they're going to be completing it. Okay, let's head into the software for a bit. Now, before we start down a rabbit hole of all the do's and don'ts to building an accessible form, the wonderful news for Snap users is that we do have somewhat of a get out of jail card in the form of a plain text version alongside a standard version. Both versions are built and produced at the same time, and if using our supplied templates, producing both is actually the default setting. So I'm going to go straight into the sort of outputted page for this particular survey. Just sort of work my way a little bit through this survey. So this is the sort of standard version, and this can contain all the sort of dynamic behavior, including routing, enforcing responses, ensuring that responses are valid, using sort of text substitution, grid rotation, answer rotation. So basically a fully dynamic survey. But it's likely that some of this formatting is not going to satisfy all of the web accessibility guidelines. So we therefore recommend that you do include a plain version of all your projects. And for those of you that haven't noticed before, or perhaps just haven't set it up before, by default at the top of every survey is a link taking you to that plain text version or text-only version. So you just build the survey in the normal way, and when published, this link will appear at the top. Before I click it, I'm just going to go back to the very beginning of the survey. So this is the standard version. So this will be the first thing that gets read out by a text reader. And if they want to press that button, you can see it takes you to the text-only version. And in short, it's stripped out some of the dynamic content to make it more compatible with screen readers, or make it as compatible as it can be, and also as compliant to the WCAG 2.2 guidelines. This does mean that this survey now loses some of the sort of dynamic functionality, but it means that you can design your survey knowing that there's a plain text version available to anyone who wishes to view that. And as mentioned, the plain text version is accessed via this link at the top, and you can actually jump back and forth between the two at any stage throughout the survey. Moving between the two, so this is the standard version, move back to the text version. The main difference is the lack of images, so all the images have been stripped out. But also, if looking at these sort of grid questions, they're all presented as sort of individual questions rather than a grid format. So the key here is that it's easy to navigate for the text reader around the screen. Now, the link can be edited in terms of the wording, but you do just need to ensure that the text that you use is clear and straightforward, and we'll be talking more about hyperlinks a bit later. Now, I'm going to go back into the survey itself in Snap, and we can get to the settings for the text-only version under questionnaire properties, and we have W3C. And this is where you can view and edit any of these settings. But if you are going to be playing around with these, you might want to do a bit more sort of background reading before you make any adjustments. Personally, I would just leave everything ticked. At the beginning, we did mention that accessibility isn't just about people who use text readers. It's about everyone who wants to access your survey. Yes, you could send everyone to this plain text version, but they will be losing out on some of the more dynamic experiences. The aim has to be to make that standard version as compliant as you can, negating the need for people to switch out to that plain version. So let's begin. We're going to start off talking about images. Now, images are great. They break up a passage of text. They often provide a splash of colour, and if nothing else, they just add to the general layout of your questionnaire and form. They can also be used to make content easier to understand, especially when considering younger participants, those whose first language isn't that of the written content, and those with certain learning difficulties. But they can also be one of the easiest ways to fall down when it comes to accessibility. Luckily though, it's one of the easiest fixes by ensuring that your images have alt text. Now if I double click on my image, alt text, which is down the bottom, is essentially pop-up text which appears when you hover over an image. But more importantly, this alt text or alternative text is what's going to be read out by a screen reader. But in using alt text, it's important to keep it relevant and useful. So don't end up putting sort of additional information on there or using it for light-hearted humour, as some quite famous organisations have fallen foul of in the past. You need to keep it straight and to the point. For example, you don't need to say this is an image of such and such, because the screen reader is going to do that bit for you. So straight to the point, really. And I don't think I need to say it, but images, they should not flash or blink more than 3 times per second. But I don't think we're stuck in the 80s, so I don't think we need to mention that one too much. Now, images can be a very good thing. For example, you could use warning signs or exclamation marks to sort of draw attention to something important. And that's a really good technique. But what we don't want to be doing is then using the alt text to say what the issue was. So yes, have an image of an exclamation mark, but the actual warning message needs to be outside that image. Now, something you might come across when reading about images is contrast ratio. And although it does get mentioned in reference to images, it's more referencing any text that you might have within an image. So I'm going to hold off discussing that for the time being. But what I would say is that text within an image isn't good. And by text, I mean lines of text. So I'm not sort of talking about where you've got a company logo and that you've got your company name in there. I'm talking about actual lines of text. So here I have an image. And yes, that text is part of that image. Now, if you have got a line of text within your image, then I'd hazard a guess that that text is required information for the person completing the form. But you need to remember that there will be many people who won't be seeing that image because they'll be viewing the text-only version, or they're perhaps visually impaired and just can't see it very well in the first place. Remember, a screen reader will only be reading the alt text, so you need to question whether or not this information is going to get across to them. So do we need to make that information available outside of the image as well? And if the answer is yes, then really you should consider not having that text in the image in the first place. So could we instead do what I've done on this second example, which is have a title or subtitle where I've added a background image, or sorry, a background color, and then I've just typed some text over the top of it. So it's text as opposed to an image. If I go into the picture of the background, I have then inserted a picture, a logo, and again I've got my alt text down there. So I'll run this as a live survey a second. So the top one is the image, and you can see there is pop-up text, but yes, I am only getting that word saying survey banner. And as we discussed, we don't want to put too much text in there, whilst down below, this is actual text which will be read out by a text reader. There's no hover text until we hover over the actual icon, and then we get the alt text then. Moving on to videos, we need to make sure that if you have got a video that it has captions. So many people will be using them because they are, as we discussed, perhaps in a public place and they don't have the sound on. I'm just going to stop that one now so we don't get distracted. But back to my point about images containing required information, and even if it isn't essential information, do you want someone to make someone feel like they're missing out on something because they're not able to play the video or perhaps hear the video? So for that reason, we really need to make this transcript available to read separately to that video file, be that in the traditional way or via a screen reader. So you could perhaps host the transcript file on a website and provide a link to it, as I've done here. I'm not actually going to click that today because it's actually going to send you off to the BBC website, but I've got a hyperlink which would take me off to that transcript. Or using Snap, we could have that transcript within Snap, and then I have an option to essentially turn on that transcript. In my case, it's turning on additional information. So this is, as done here, a really useful technique when you want to offer up additional information, but you don't necessarily want it to be available. Well, you don't want it to be on display all the time. It's an optional option for this additional information, or as I said, if we're talking videos, the transcript. So let's have a quick look at that in Snap. So I've added a multi-choice question. What I've actually done is turned off the question text, and I've also gone to positions and aligned the code box to the right just to make it sort of stand out or set aside a little bit from a standard question in Snap. Now, the reason I've made it multi-choice rather than a single choice is this will allow the respondent to effectively tick the box, but equally they can then turn it back off again, so they don't have to have that extra information on the screen all the time. And then this instructional text is just rooted on that question. So if we look at the routing, so I named the question, the tick box question above, renamed it as add info, and then the expression add info OK simply means that they've given a valid response to whatever that question was. Also added a border, again, just to sort of distinguish this from the rest of my questionnaire. Mentioned URL links, and you can see I've got my URL link at the top. Bit of advice on that. First of all, you don't want your links to be too long, so you don't want to put the full sort of link in to be clicked on, because yes, it's just going to be far too long to read. But you also need to make sure that the link text is easy to understand. So not just sort of click here. They need to know what they're clicking on. So in my case, I said it's not really going off to the video transcript. It's going off to the BBC website, but it's only because I don't have my transcript anywhere. But yes, it could be the name of your website. It doesn't need to be the full HTTP that they're clicking on. It could just be snapsurveys.com that they're actually clicking on. And when talking about inserting links, we can also discuss HTML, because essentially this is inserted HTML. So that can be used to add CSS to a survey, which can be used to aid accessibility. Now, CSS is basically additional formatting and functionality. What HTML you might add is up to you. I'm not going to be giving sort of suggestions here, but really just wanted to make you aware that should you have a need or requirement to add something, then yes, you can do that with HTML coding. Now, I'm going to pop back to my PowerPoint for a bit. And we're going to start talking a little bit about text layout and language. So you need to be careful how your text is laid out. Too wide and people are going to have to be reading sort of too far left to right, and they might then lose their place on the page, particularly if it's a larger paragraph, as well as feeling like they're at the tennis match going left and right constantly. Too narrow and it will produce big gaps where words have sort of had to be jumped onto the next line, as well as making it look like a big block of text with everything sort of merging into itself. Tricks up your sleeve for this include the general sort of page setup, which states sort of how wide the page will actually be. So the default setting is normally 1024, which is around about the sort of width of an old-fashioned screen monitor. So basically, if someone's got a massive widescreen monitor, it will sort of only go as wide as sort of the central, it'll be centralized down the middle of their screen. But we've also got column settings and margins, and they can be found on the topics drop-down menu. In terms of fonts, we need to be careful and sort of try and avoid lots of different font sizes. Yes, you're going to want to have different font sizes for headers and sort of section headers, but make sure that they're consistent throughout. It will help the respondent to understand what that item on the page is. And do also just stick to one font type, because no one really wants to be looking at a multitude of different font types on this page. And although font size isn't actually a stipulation of WCAG, it's generally regarded that a font size of 16 pixels or more is good practice. Now, pixels or PX is actually a web format, whereas a lot of software is actually initially input using a font size set to points or PT. Word, for example, uses a PT font because it's based on paper, and likewise so does Snap, because there's generally a paper edition running in the background of most projects within Snap. So the generally regarded good practice of 16 pixels or more equates to a point size of 12 within Snap. But as mentioned, there's nothing to say you can't go smaller, it's just you need to consider your audience. Another good one, don't overuse capitals. So a whole sentence in capitals will not only make it look like your great auntie or uncle sent you a text message, it's also going to be harder to read on screen. Again, accessibility is all about usability. Negative space is good. So negative space is about making sure there is space around things and try not to squeeze too much into one page. So think of it around as sort of margins around different items. In Snap, you have various tools at your disposal to allocate more or less space to things. We have space before, margins and tabs, and they can also be found on the topics menu along with columns, as we saw just in the previous page. Of course, the layout of your questionnaire is a small part of it, and equally important to the layout is the content. So the language you use and how you use it. So consider the terminology used, especially if it's going to be seen by respondents who are sort of outside your inner circle. So they're not going to understand necessarily your sort of jargon. But good question design writing is probably a topic for another day. But as I've mentioned a couple of times, accessibility is about inclusivity. So be careful not to belittle your audience with your word choices. when discussing images earlier, I mentioned contrast ratio. To confirm here, we're talking about how dark or light something is in relation to the background. So typically we're talking text color versus background color. The magic number here is 4.5 to 1, which basically means that the text needs to be 4.5 times as dark or light as the background it's sitting on. And there's lots of websites out there which you can use to check sort of various elements of accessibility. A couple which I used for contrast include WebAIM and Learn UI Design. So WebAIM will let you type in 2 colors and confirm accessibility levels, whereas Learn UI Design will take your chosen colors and give you a close alternative if it isn't accessible. I should add, I added the bit about the cousin. So let's have a look at a survey in desktop. And let's have a look at the default navigational buttons. So if you're using our sort of supplied templates, then the default navigational buttons, so the next to back, are a color of 117, 117, 117. So we've got our RGB numbers as they're known. Unfortunately, the WebAIM contrast checker actually uses what's known as a hex number instead of RGB. So one of our first jobs is actually to convert this 117 into the hex number. So a quick Google search will find loads and loads of sites that will do that. Personally, I tend to use something called Rapid Tables. So I'll just click on that one. So I can type in my code 117, 117 and convert that one. I then have my hex code. If we then go into WebAIM, the contrast checker, so we've got the foreground and the background. So my background is effectively 75, 75, 75. And on top of my buttons, I have white text. And you can see that's come up with a contrast ratio of 4.6 to 1. And if you remember, the magic number we're trying to get at least or above is actually 4.5. So that is fine. If, however, I was to take a color which isn't going to be accessible, so I've got sort of a light blue here, again on white with white text sitting on top of it, you can see it's not accessible. In fact, it's quite a long way off being accessible. So I'm going to take that code and pop it into this Learn UI Design. And I pop my code in there. You can see it's not accessible. If it was accessible, which we know it isn't already, it would have a tick here, but it's suggested this color instead. So again, I could then take that color, so I can just copy it, go back into a contrast checker, and the closest match which is going to be accessible is this one. So just a useful way basically that if your company colors aren't going to be accessible for what you want, then you can try and find something similar. Now, some of you may have heard of the term ARIA role. You can use the ARIA role attribute to provide more information about the structure of a document to the users of sort of the assistive technologies. And this can be useful in documents as it gives the additional information to that end user about what an item is on the page. You can add an ARIA role in the variable properties of a question. So I've got an example here using sort of the word header at the bottom. So that would just allow the person using the text reader to jump from sort of header to header rather than having to sort of move sort of question to question. Now, in a questionnaire, that might feel like that's counterproductive to how you'd want people to actually interact with it. But someone who was actually viewing that document may well have a quick glance around the document looking at the sort of headers before they start filling in the survey. So why shouldn't someone who's using assistive technology have exactly those same options? Now, I would say this is not a simple topic, and if you are going to assign an ARIA role, you do need to be very careful that you aren't making it actually quite nonsensical for the sort of assistive technology product. So in short, if you're going to go down this route, you need to really know what you're doing and make sure that you're not sort of doing more harm than good. Basically, you're going to have to do some reading, I'm afraid, and make sure that you're not adding conflicting information onto your form. So put an address here. I will email this to you later, but that's some good long reading to try and get your head around if that's something you might want to look at. Usability is as important as accessibility, and it's all part of the same thing. So what you really need to avoid is someone asking themselves, do I click here? Nope. Do I do this? Nope. You may well get a colleague saying, but your survey's now plain and boring. Well, yes, it is plain, but this is the online world that we live in now. It's plain and usable. You aren't making people having to consider how they're going to answer it. If you look at some of the biggest companies around the world, looking at their websites, their social media platforms, their emails that are sent, you'll notice that actually, if something is important, it will be conveyed using 3 colours: black, blue, and white. We haven't really mentioned blue as such, but there's a reason why hyperlinks are blue, and that's because it's one of the most contrasting colours that you can get. It's also become synonymous with something that is clickable, be that a link or a button. Now, there is a lot of things to consider, and I've certainly not covered everything today, but there are some free tools out there to aid you with the building of your forms to make them as user-friendly and accessible as you can. One example of this is WAVE, which stands for Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. This highlights issues and positives on a page and sits as an extension on your browser. Now, I'm going to run a quick example of a survey where I know I've got some issues. So I'm going to run this survey here. So you can see I've got a logo at the top with some alt text. I've got some tick boxes. I've got a hyperlink. I've got another logo. I've got my navigational buttons. So everything a normal survey would have, to be honest. And then at the top, I got this extension, which is called Wave. I said it's completely free. If I click this one, it will give me a mini report. Luckily, I've got no major errors, but I have got some alerts and some contrast errors. So if I click on details, we can then have a look at some of these items. If we start with the contrast, actually. So my link below, so a very low contrast, only 1.97, and as we know, the contrast should be a minimum of 4.5, and that's because I manually changed my link to be orange rather than the standard blue. Likewise, my navigational buttons, they're also not contrasting enough. Okay. It might be that if I put black text on them, that might work. We'd have to check that. We then have some alerts. So my logo. So my main logo, it's got some hover text in, really quite long hover text, and you can see the message says that it's a long alternative message. And the message I put in there, it's a bit of a silly message, but it's really sort of highlighting what the issue is. I'm putting more information into this alt message than actually anyone viewing that image would see. So you're putting more information into the alt text than anyone not viewing that alt text would actually know. So it's suggesting we remove that one. We've also got an alert down on my other image. Now it's a green one this time, so it's not necessarily bad, but it's just telling me what's going on. So it's just alerting me that there is no alt text on that image. And as I said, it's not necessarily bad because actually there are certain situations where you don't actually have to have alt text. But I personally would say, why wouldn't you? So personally, I would say always use alt text and then you know you're covered. Now, parting thoughts. First of all, don't make your images and videos your message. So they are a way of making things look nice, and that's very important, of course, but they shouldn't be the thing on the page that is going to convey your message. And when it comes to survey design, often less is more. Yes, you can jazz it up with your colours, but whilst that is going to please some people, there's likely to be just as many red-faced people who might perceive that as bad design from an overall look, but also more importantly, be very aware of your colours and contrast between things, as you don't want to be putting people off or even worse, excluding them. Accessibility is about inclusion and more importantly about avoiding exclusion. Okay, that's everything I had planned to show you today. Appreciate it has been a lot of content and a lot of listening with not as much actual snap content as usual, but I do hope you found it useful and it's perhaps prompted a thought or two on how you might need to edit some of your existing projects, if nothing else. As mentioned, it's likely that you are going to want to do some further reading on some of the elements that I've mentioned today. So on screen now are some QR codes that you might find useful, including links off to the sites that I've been mentioning today and sort of using a little bit today. But don't worry, I will be emailing you in the next sort of day or so with links to these and also a recording of today's webinar. A parting request, if you have got 2 minutes to complete a short questionnaire about today's webinar, I'd really appreciate that. That can be found by using the last QR code on the right, or alternatively, there's a link in the chat of this Teams call. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.